Hey, friends, welcome to another episode of Space for Life. And today's conversation is one I've actually been looking forward to for a long time. My special guest, Vic Marchetti, and I have been talking about doing a podcast together probably for, I guess, probably over a year and been waiting for just the right timing. And so I'm very excited about today's conversations. Could be unique and a little bit different from other ones. Vic is now my long-standing, over probably almost 2 years, a personal trainer. And I actually never imagined being in a situation of utilizing a personal trainer, but Vic has been absolutely game-changing for me. And beyond that, we've just developed such a neat, life-giving friendship over these couple years that we've been working together and that I've been working with him. And I've never really done a podcast on kind of physical wellness. I had a podcast a while back that was on nutrition with Jim and Nicole Holland, and that was fantastic. But haven't done something. So I want to kind of lay the context for why I think this is worth doing for Space for Life and what it has to do with the rest of the things that we talk about on Space for Life. So, about now 4 years ago, I began a journey into trying to become more well physically. And it began at a point in time where I was just frankly carrying a lot more weight than I wanted to, and realized that as I was getting older, that if I didn't do something about this, that I might never do anything about it. So I set a goal, and I've talked about this on a couple of podcasts. I set a goal to try to get functionally my eating in line and made some great progress. And I framed that goal around the phrase of clean the temple and keep it clean, because the Bible refers to our bodies as the temple of the Holy Spirit. So I figured I wasn't treating the temple very well and I needed to clean it out and try to keep it clean, which has a lot to do with what this podcast is about. About 6 months, a year into that journey, I realized that getting my eating straight was only a piece of the game. And I began to work at a gym called Catalyst Fit, and then quickly began to work with Vic, who works in partnership with Catalyst Fit and is the owner operator of Next Form Fitness. And Vic and I just immediately kind of hit it off, just in terms of the way we look at physical fitness, the way we look at personal growth, trying to live a life of meaning across our relationships, our family. And, in the space of an hour working out, you get a lot of time to talk about a lot of stuff. And we have over the years, even meeting, for a good while outside of the fitness times to talk about life together. So I've just come to appreciate Vic so much as a person, and his expertise and how he has helped me so much in the physical fitness realm has been absolutely huge for me. So I wanted to bring him on primarily because in this journey, I have realized how absolutely connected our physical well-being is with our mental well-being, our relational well-being, our spiritual well-being, and our mental well-being. It's all so closely connected. And I don't think I realized that at first. I kind of thought I'm just trying to get in shape. And I had no idea of the massive impact this would have across all the other spheres of my life. So I want to have a conversation about physical fitness, but almost on a deeper level of why is this important? What difference does this make other than perhaps vanity, And so Vic is a great person to have this conversation with. So I'm so excited, Vic, to have you on board Space for Life and to have this conversation. So Thanks for being here.
No, man, Tommy, of course. Like you said, we've been talking about this for a while, so happy to be here and thanks for having me, man. Like you said, we've developed a pretty sound relationship outside of just our time training together. But in talking about doing this, you asked me to maybe give folks a little bit of insight into how I got to this place in my life and how I found this profession. And so I figured that's what I might want to do to begin with, is just kind of give everybody an idea of how I ended up here, right? Because the path, it can head in so many different directions. And there's a lot of events that ultimately bring us to where we are at any given point in time. So
Yeah,
if that's
absolutely.
okay with you, I'd like to share a
Hey,
little bit of that with everybody.
great.
I grew up in a middle class family, hardworking parents, and pretty early on found soccer. And that was an outlet for me my entire life. But like most boys, energetic, always wanting to wrestle around and play pickup sports with all my buddies. And soccer was the thing that I ultimately fell into and fell in love with. So I played pretty competitively for my entire childhood, all the way up into high school. And the idea was having two parents who didn't go to college and who, like I said, were pretty hardworking, blue collar individuals my whole life. They were very adamant about my siblings and I trying to go to college. So the idea for me all along was soccer was my key to getting into a school somewhere. And unfortunately, I think I was maybe 16 and I actually had an incident in a game where I fractured a vertebrae in my back.
Oof.
And long story short, after several months of trying to figure out what was going on and why I was having the issues that I was having, a few different types of assessments, they finally discovered that I did indeed fracture a vertebrae in my back. And the doctor told me that based on where that fracture was, there was nothing that they could do to accelerate the healing process. There was no splinting, nothing other than just rest and trying to avoid anything that would aggravate the area that I could do to heal up. And so for a number of months, I tried to stick with just supporting the team, going to every practice, traveling to all of the tournaments. And at the time, I was playing for my club team, which is like a travel team. I was playing for the Northern Virginia district team. I was playing for the Virginia state team, and I was trying to balance all of that. And then after a few months, it just got really emotionally taxing, not being able to participate. And so I ultimately decided to step away from soccer. And during that time, at, like I said, maybe 16 years old, 17 years old, going into my junior year, it's a pretty important time academically. If you're thinking about going to college, you're thinking about SATs, you're thinking about applying to schools. And up until that point, I had always done just fine in school, but I had never really thought about anything other than playing soccer in college.
Right.
So as I began to get better along the way, probably dabbled in more what's the word I'm looking for? Extracurricular activities than I really should have for somebody who needs to be focused on preparing for the future. And that set me back in some ways, but ultimately kind of got through that rough patch. And I found bodybuilding as an outlet for the part of me that still had this urge to exert myself physically.
Could you
And so I
do that
really
with
kind of,
your back very well?
it did. And, you know, that was a transition. So as the back started to feel better, I at one point went back and played some soccer for a buddy of mine who started a club team. And I think just from an entire childhood and adolescence of just high level of commitment, maybe I was just a little bit burnt out. And so I ultimately decided that I really wasn't interested in going back and playing competitive soccer, but I still
Mhm.
had that urge that all of us athletes do. I wanted to do something physical. And so I found the gym and I found bodybuilding. And up until that point, I had never really even stepped foot inside of a gym. I was a soccer player and most of our training was sport specific and happened on the soccer field. So I found weightlifting and I started lifting weights in my grandmother's basement with a set of dumbbells that my dad had had for forever that were in storage. So he brought those out and I started working out a few times a week at her house. And I remember I would go down and I'd listen to a Bruce Springsteen album that was my father's also. And I would work out and then I'd go upstairs and my grandmother would open a can of tuna because at the time that If I knew nothing else, I knew protein was important. So I wanted to make sure I got my protein in. So I'd work out like a madman for an hour, hour and a half, and then go eat a bunch of protein. And that was sort of my initial introductory to resistance training. So as I shipped off to college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to study. I kind of went through my first semester or two.
Where'd you go to
Not,
college?
so my freshman year, again, because of the extracurriculars and the lack of additional preparation, I only got into my safety school. They always told us apply to a school that's a reach, apply to a school that you feel pretty good about being able to get into, and then apply to a safety school if all else fails. And unfortunately, all else failed. And I only got into my safety school, Radford University. So that
Oh,
for anybody who's not familiar, that's way out in Blacksburg or past Blacksburg. And it's a pretty small rural kind of area. It's near Virginia Tech, but there's not a whole lot going on outside of academics and social life, partying for
oh,
the most part. And that just wasn't really what I was interested in rather, especially since I had sort of started to find this desire to train my body and to try to build myself up. And I knew that alcohol and some of that stuff just wasn't conducive to doing that. So I didn't really have much interest in partying at that point. But I did realize pretty quickly that I wasn't very interested in staying in Radford for 4 years. And the young lady who I dated in high school and into college, she was here at VCU. And so I was visiting pretty frequently as it was. And at the end of my freshman year of college, I decided to transfer to VCU. I made that transition. And again, now into my sophomore year, still really not sure what I wanted to study. And at one point, I remember thinking to myself that that was a problem. And maybe I should talk to somebody about that. So I went and met with one of the advisors, and she took a look at my transcripts and everything and said, well, based on what you've done so far and what courses you have taken, the thing that your current track of study most closely aligns with would be like a psychology degree. And I just thought, in terms of trying to get through a 4 year program and make sure that I walked across the stage and got my diploma in a reasonable amount of time, that I should probably just go with what I was already sort of on track with accomplishing. And I did that for about a semester or two, and then realized again very rapidly that that was not the thing that I wanted to be doing for the rest of my life. So by happenstance, one of the young men that I was living with at the time, a roommate of mine, was an exercise science major. And we were talking about classes, and he started talking about some of the classes he was taking in these, classes about biomechanics and exercise physiology, all these things that to me were right in the wheelhouse of what it was that I was personally most interested in. And so I said, that's what I need to go enroll in. I need to get myself into the exercise science program. And so that's what I did. Tacked on an extra year of undergrad, but that was fine. I was perfectly content with that and ended up graduating with my degree in exercise science in the fall of, or spring of 2010. And I've been doing this ever since. I've been in all different aspects of the health and wellness industry. I've worked in corporate fitness at Fortune 500 company. I've worked in commercial fitness, which is what most people probably think of, like a Gold's Gym or an American Family, that type of establishment. I've worked in sports performance, and now I work in private performance or private personal training. So we operate in a small studio. All of our clients come in per appointment, as you know. We don't have just general memberships for people to come and go on their own. And it's a pretty specialized and individualized service that we provide. And that has become one of the greatest gifts that I've ever received and didn't see coming, is ending up in an establishment in an arena like this one here, where the types of individuals that we get to work with, they're here because they want to be. Like you, there was something that sets you down this course of trying to improve yourself, and you had maybe more surface level reasons initially, but like you said, as you've sort of embraced this journey, you found that there's a whole bunch of additional depth to it if you're willing to embrace that. And for me, it's really rewarding because this is an aspect of people's lives that can be intimidating, especially if it's something new to them or if it's something that they're unfamiliar with. or if they're the type of person who didn't grow up playing sports and just doesn't really know what it means to challenge themselves physically or mentally in that way. And we establish a really deep rapport with the folks who we get to work with here because of the fact that they're here on their own accord and they really want to be. They're not just paying $20 or $30 for a session because it was lumped in with their membership that they chose to sign up for at the top of the new year at
Right.
your local big box gym. It's a little bit more. There's a little bit more motivation for individuals who come to a place like this, and so we get to establish long-lasting relationships with the folks that we work with, and we get to really develop friendships outside of just the time that we spend together. So that is sort of what I would say the big picture of a couple of big events and things that sort of transpired to ultimately help me end up here. And you and I talk a lot about how things happen for a reason and how you have to be willing to recognize that. And it took a while for me to recognize that this was truly my purpose and that I am very fortunate to do what I do and to do it with the people who I do it with.
Well, it's real obvious to me, and there's some things that I kind of pay attention to, when I work with someone for myself or for them, and you know, one is their heart really in it? Because some people can be reasonably good at something, but there's this sense that they're just going through the motions. And that's certainly never been the sense with you. And, you're a lot younger than I. And one of the things that I became very aware of is the depth of your knowledge when it comes to all of the things, related to working out. I mean, it feels like it's been 100 times I've asked you, in the deep weeds type of question about, something physically. And, you're not just pulling an answer off the top of your head. You really know your stuff, which has given me a lot of confidence of knowing that I'm in safe hands in terms of what's going on. But all of that kind of getting, down a different path. There are two things that I'd love to really explore, in our conversation together. One that we'll get to on the back end is if someone is wanting to move forward in the way of giving more attention to their body and taking care of their body for whatever the reasons would be, how would they get started? And we'll talk about that. How would they get started if they're not going to work with a physical, a trainer, a personal trainer, if they don't have maybe access to, a full gym and everything, how would they get going on that? But kind of more importantly, what's really intrigued me that was the surprise for me is that when I began to give attention to physical wellness, the breadth of it, nutrition and physical fitness, I thought, well, okay, I'll feel better physically. What I didn't realize is the kind of cascading effect that would have on all the other areas of my life, from the amount of energy that I had to put into other things, but also the sense of strength that I felt that translated into mental strength, mindset, emotional strength, uh, even spiritual strength. That when I took care of this area that I was not taking care of, not terribly neglecting, but just not giving it much attention, it gave a laxness that translated into all these other areas. When I began to take care of it, it actually translated into a really significant level of power that was applied to all these other areas. And this connection, I think, between physical, our bodies, and our spirit and our minds and our soul is something that I maybe gave intellectual assent to, but I just didn't really understand until I did this. So I'd love for you to maybe just expound on that for a minute in terms of your experience of what happens in your life, but also as you see it in other people's lives when they start to get and give attention to their bodies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's something that I have spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about over the course of my career. So, simply put, next form. Um, that's not a name. That's more of a philosophy or a concept that I like to share with clients. At any point in time, we are who or what we are, mentally, physically, spiritually. This is the form, the physical form, perceived form that we take. And in my opinion, that's a very fluid state of being. And anybody can conceptualize that, I think. You have good days, you have bad days, our moods, our emotions, our physical amount of energy, all of these things, they're not static, they shift. It is also my opinion that we have more control over it than many of us realize. I think you and I were talking about this the other day, or even actually earlier today, we were talking about this, how we've all become so good at compartmentalizing things, making them separate from one another. And that includes our mental health, our physical health, our spiritual health, our emotional well being. We look at them as these different things, but the truth is they are all intertwined and they all affect each other. Despite what your belief is, even if you just looked at it from a physiological perspective, there are things that alter our chemistry as a response to stimulus. And nutrition, other mental practices, breath work, all of these things can be really, really effective ways to sort of manipulate what's going on inside of us chemically, which can then have a profound impact on how we're feeling on any number of levels. But in my opinion, I believe that physical activity, exercise, stressing, and I use that term loosely, but creating some sort of demand on the body in a physical manner is the trump card. I think that we are supposed to move. I think that we are supposed to experience a little bit of physical adversity and discomfort on a regular basis. And I think that when we don't do that, it sets us up for potentially pretty negative outcomes over time. A great
Yeah.
example.
Well, think about COVID. I mean, COVID is, I think, kind of the perfect example. I mean, you watched during those years of COVID, you watched the deterioration of so many people on so many fronts simply because they stopped moving, which then I think opened up all sorts of levels of stress and anxiety and depression. And you think, well, what does one have to do with another? And it's exactly the point. They are completely interrelated. And I don't per se suggest that one trumps the other. I think in the big sense of things, I think the spiritual trumps everything. But the spiritual is impacted, incredibly by these other areas, our ability to, access and to focus and to quiet ourselves, as so much to do with the state of our bodies,
So one of the practices that I have in place for myself that you helped me develop actually is my daily oath to self. It's a note I review and it's got some important reminders that I need to give myself on a daily basis to sort of set my state of mind. And one of the things that is always at the top of the list is being willing and able to be uncomfortable.
Mm.
And when you talk about spirituality, I think that that's a hard thing for some people to define, especially if it's somebody who maybe isn't familiar with the concept of, um, or doesn't have any sort of like real spiritual practice or hasn't gone through any kind of deeper work to discover who they are spiritually. And you know this, but that's the journey that I'm on for myself as well. Really, over the past couple of years, as my wife and I have started a family, really tried to put more emphasis on that aspect of my life and nurturing it and trying to figure out what that looks like and how it plays a role in helping me maximize all these other areas of my life. And when I say maximize, I don't necessarily mean from a productivity standpoint. I just mean from a fulfillment standpoint
Right.
for me, as well as for those people who I interact with and who rely on me to bring something to the relationship. And it doesn't matter what sort of day I'm having. And I see this with a lot of clients that'll come in, and you've experienced this on occasion as well, just not feeling it. There might be a lot going on professionally or personally. And there's something that's really cleansing, really therapeutic about coming into this space and focusing on one thing and one thing alone. And that is our task at hand, whatever that might be for my client and myself at that point in time. You can block out all these other distractions, all these other things that keep your mind running in maybe to a counterproductive degree, where you've got all of this, like you said, the temple has got all of this stuff, all this clutter. And this is one of those places where I think a lot of people, when they come in, when they're done, they've been able to purge, at least momentarily, some of the clutter and can come out on the other side feeling a little bit more prepared, a little bit more capable, a little more confident in being able to go ahead and face those other things that are maybe daunting to them when they begin the day. And when I first meet with folks, I try to explain to them that there are two main goals I have. One is I want them to leave feeling better than when they showed up every time they walk through the door. And that looks different depending on the day, depending on the individual, depending on the circumstances. And the other thing that I always try to stress to them is this is a relationship. Like I mentioned earlier, we're fortunate in this setting that we are able to develop close relationships with our clientele because we do spend time together in an area of most of these folks' lives that is one that might be a little bit sensitive or might be something that they're not quite so confident with. So we build some rapport and trust, and then that ultimately leads us down all sorts of different types of conversations and getting to know one another in different aspects of life. And when I come into a session with an individual, after having done this so long, you develop a sense of what they need that day from a physical standpoint. They may say, "Oh, I feel great and I'm ready to work." And then pretty quickly you recognize that maybe that's not really where they are. Maybe you need to try to help them. They might not even realize that that's not where they are. They might be subconsciously trying to overcome something else. And it's not always a blunt conversation. It's not always a black and white scenario, but that's part of what I consider to be the craft of coaching and personal training is developing over time with so many hours of seeing so many different people from so many different walks of life with so many different backgrounds and so many different sets of limitations and goals. And you start to develop an ability to be able to recognize what a person might need beyond just the 60 minutes of grueling,
Right.
intense exercise, which for most people is not what they need on a regular basis.
Well, one of
And
the things I love that you've said, you talked about earlier, this, the value of doing something that is uncomfortable to you.
yeah,
And, as much as we've had a great time over the couple of years, there's a pretty significant portion of those times that I think I don't really want to do this today. I'm
Yeah.
always glad at the end, but there's something really positive that happens when you, myself as an individual, chooses to do something that is positive and helpful that you don't particularly want to do.
Yeah.
And that's one of those places that I think these things translate and cascade into other areas. You talked about kind of the spiritual area of your life. You know, in our talking together over time, there was a point, and it's part of the mindset that I think that you have that comes out of your physical fitness background and everything else that says, I want to regularly sit down and identify where I need to grow and where I need to improve, and I'll step right into it. It doesn't matter that it's uncomfortable for you, and for you kind of stepping into some of this, spiritual growth world has not been the most normal thing for you. But you said, well, I see this as a place that I can grow. And I think that is so helpful for people to develop, I think, the courage and the strength and the mindset of, I'm not afraid of doing something that's uncomfortable. You and I joke a lot about cold plunges as one of those
Yeah.
things. Like, I mean, how in the world am I going to get into this freezing cold water? And you think your first thought is, I can't.
Mhm.
And then when you finally cross that threshold and you do, you realize, well, I might choose not to. And that begins to affect the way you think about everything. Things that, are in your business, things are in your family. You begin to realize I have a lot more strength, not physical strength. I have a lot more strength of will and strength of mind and strength of emotion than I ever imagined. And that's where these things start to cross all over. When I realize, in a sense, that I'm so much stronger than I did, I bring that even into my relationship with God, and so it's, it's a, it's a game changer from the perspective of you see all of the world more as possibilities I have than I ever did. And, you know, just even as you express your own things, I've seen that true for you too.
Well,
So
I think you hit the nail on the head. It really comes down to facing some kind of adversity, overcoming that adversity, and how powerful that is in terms of affecting all different aspects of life. And there are so many things that we can do to challenge ourselves. But one thing that is universally understood is being physically uncomfortable. And I don't mean you have to come in here and be pushed to the brink of, getting sick or
yeah,
injury or anything like that. No, it doesn't require nearly as much as I think the average person assumes it does. But what it does do is it instills a sense of confidence. Like you mentioned, it instills a sense of being capable. And not only that, but we're hardwired in a way where when we overcome adversity, our minds, our bodies, our spirits recognizes that and then begins to seek more of it out. And I think that that's one of the most unanticipated aspects or benefits from a routine of physical exercise that a lot of people discover once they actually commit to it and begin to build a little bit of momentum is I didn't think that this was going to be so motivating in ways beyond what I expected in terms of maybe that pursuing that goal that I have that might be a little bit more about vanity or performance of some kind. No, it starts to translate pretty quickly and pretty effectively into a bunch of other areas of life. And I think that
Yes.
that is one of the most beneficial aspects of resistance training or exercise or physical activity of any kind that does push you just a little bit outside of your comfort zone is you really can use it as a catalyst to start to see more desire, more drive, more appreciation, more enjoyment in adversity elsewhere in your life. And it sort of primes you to want to problem solve as opposed to sitting back and thinking, well, these are all the reasons I can't do this particular thing. Well, here's the ways that I can attack this particular problem and start to make some progress. And so I think that just from a chemical standpoint, from an experiential standpoint, I think that that's one of the biggest and most unanticipated outcomes of regular physical exercise.
Absolutely. I think another huge benefit for me is, as we try to grow as a human being, as an adult, we often hit a lot of roadblocks and we hit a lot of places where we can become convinced pretty easily that we're not capable of changing, that nothing is going to change, nothing's going to change in our families, that these weaknesses that we have, that we're not going to be able to overcome them. When you take on the area of physical wellness, one of the things that kind of surprised me is that I did change, that I did actually get stronger, that I could see changes physically with me. And all of a sudden, this area that I had not been successful with for decades, honestly, in terms of any kind of significant change, there was meaningful progress. And the minute that I experienced that meaningful progress, I went, well, if I can experience growth, I mean, change in this area, why can't I experience change in this area? And that's where it opens up this world of possibility across all the spheres of our life. In fact, it pervades everything because it becomes a part of the way you think. It becomes a part of mindset. And because physical wellness is so tangible and visible, it has a unique way of creating that. So, one of my hopes, I guess, for those listening is that this is an area that so many people experience shame. It's an area that people experience defeat in a lot of times, and it's an area that people don't feel well about. And my encouragement is that people can begin to see that I can make steps in a positive direction in this area of physical wellness. And that when I do, I'm going to experience a newness in all of the areas of my life. And that's what I really hope will be the result of a few people listening to this podcast. So I'd love for you to share because, as you said, at the beginning, all of this is really intimidating to people. I mean, if you look in the background of your video, you've got, all sorts of dumbbells and crazy machines and and it's kind of hard to think, well, I mean, where in the world do I get started? I mean, if do I have to buy all of this equipment? How do I know how much to lift? How do I keep from hurting myself? Where do I begin? Do I just start running around a track? I'd love, because I do know you understand the breadth of all of this. I'd love for you to offer maybe like a real basic start for people who say, okay, I really haven't done hardly anything, maybe ever, or for years and years. What's a good starting plan? And then maybe we'll even take a little bit of an intermediate plan. So someone's
Okay.
40, 50 years old, whatever, and haven't given this any attention, where do you get going? Where do you get started?
So it probably stands to reason, but I'll say it so that it's just said. It really does depend on the individual, right? And circumstances are different for everybody. So I think those things always need to be taken into consideration. But you know me, and I'm always trying to sneak in a little bit of education. So for somebody who is completely unfamiliar with this space, there's just a couple of general concepts that I would urge them to try to wrap their heads around. And so, first one would be this concept of progressive overload, and all that means is physical activity is a positive, but a form of stress that creates a need for the body to change, right? And so all that means is you just need to do a little bit more than you've been doing. And if you continue to move that needle a little bit over time, just by a degree or two from week to week, month to month, year to year, your body will continue to recognize a need to become stronger or more fit in whatever capacity that you're looking to become more fit. So that's the first one, this idea of just moving the needle over time. It doesn't have to be fast and it doesn't have to be huge leaps. Second one is frequency versus intensity. A friend of mine used the analogy one time of an exercise session being something that creates a wound. Just bear with me. A wound takes time to heal, but when it heals, what has come back in place of the area that was injured is something that's a little bit stronger, a little bit more resilient. You have to figure out how to balance how hard you're working with how often you're working. So, just generally speaking, someone who might be more restricted on time, they may need to do just a little bit more, a little less often, versus somebody who maybe has a little bit more time who can do something a little less intense, but they can do it more often. So you kind of have to figure out, okay, well, what sort of time commitment am I able to make before you can really decide how much and how often you need to be doing something. And that one brings me to another concept that I really try to introduce folks to, especially individuals who are just getting started or who have a really, really hectic schedule. And that's the concept of exercise snacking. So for you and I, Tommy, for example, when you and I meet, we spend about an hour together a couple times a week, and we complete all of our work within that hour. But that doesn't mean that somebody can't accomplish that same amount of work over the course of a day or two or an entire week. And so for some folks who are trying to get started, just doing 5 minutes here, another 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here over the course of an entire day, instead of actually thinking they have to commit to a full 30 or 40 or 60 minutes of exercise, is a really effective way of approaching it. Because at the end of the day, something is always going to be better than nothing, with very, very few exceptions, in my opinion. And so if you can just begin to take steps in the direction, and you can do that over time, that will ultimately get us somewhere else. You don't always have to know what the ultimate destination is to start the journey, right? So for somebody who is looking to check some of the most, what I would say, beneficial boxes, I would say there's several things that everybody can continue to improve over time if they want to. First one being strength. Strength is at the very top, in my opinion, of priorities, especially as we age, like you were saying, into our 40s or 50s, whether you're male or female, some sort of strength development. And for some people, that might look like something as simple as sitting up in a chair and forcing themselves to get up and down 10 times before they leave the room to go do something, whatever it is that's next on their agenda. Where for somebody else, they may require something a little bit more challenging. But strength development, it's all relative. But I would say that that's the first one, is trying to continue to develop strength beyond where your strength is now. Second one would be cardiovascular fitness. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that our cardiovascular system is really a system that has a number of different phases in which we produce energy in different ways using different fuel sources. And so trying to do something that challenges you a little bit on a regular basis can go a long way in terms of cardiovascular fitness. So for somebody who maybe doesn't do anything more than walk throughout their day, just doing their daily tasks, going for a 20-minute uninterrupted walk and just staying in motion for 20 minutes could be enough for them to start to notice some improvements and to start to make some progress. For somebody else who maybe walks avidly, they might just want to try to incorporate some smaller intervals where maybe they really increase the tempo of the walk to a very, very fast walk or even a light jog for 20 seconds. And then they're back to walking for a couple of minutes. And just a few 20-second intervals of that increased effort will start to tell the body, hey, there's a new demand being placed on us. We need to try to get better at doing whatever it is we need to do to be able to do that again the next time it's asked of us. The third, what I would say overarching general concept is this idea of flexibility and mobility. Just how well can we move? And flexibility and mobility are two separate things, but for all intents and purposes, they're pretty closely related. And I think most people would have trouble differentiating one from the other. But trying to improve our ability to move without pain or trying to work through a new range of motion that maybe we haven't been implementing on a regular basis. And so, for example, going back to the sitting down and standing up piece, one of the things that I will often challenge a new client to is we'll have them, if they're able to, get all the way down on the floor and get back up using as few points of contact as possible. And that might seem like a very simple exercise, and for some people it is, and for some people it's not. But being able to get all the way down and all the way up using just your legs or using your legs in one hand requires a completely different amount of flexibility and mobility than if you have to use all fours to accomplish that task. So something very simple somebody could do if they're just generally trying to improve their overall flexibility and mobility would be to try to get into positions that you don't normally get into and challenge yourself to perform simple tasks like getting up and down off of the ground or out of a chair without the use of any more aid than you absolutely need. So instead of using the armrests to push yourself up out of a chair, see if you can do so with just your legs or just using one armrest. Those three things, strength development, cardiovascular fitness, improvements there, and trying to make improvements with your movement and how well you move. Those are the big things that I think most people should be trying to focus on developing, especially as they're thinking about just improving their overall health and wellness, and especially if they're getting to a point in their lives where they're starting to think about what they want to be capable of in the future. So you and I, we talk about that a whole lot. So if I was going to meet with somebody who was completely novice to the concept of exercise and they were looking for just a couple of very basic suggestions on how they could start to approach some sort of regular exercise routine, there's just a few things that I would ask them to consider. I would say, one, think about performing somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes of quote unquote strength development. And we talked about a couple of examples of what that might look like 2 times, 3 times a week. Doesn't take a whole lot. So 10 minutes, 15 minutes over the course of an entire day, even doesn't have to happen all at once, but try to do that so that you're accumulating somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes over the course of the week.
Yeah, and you don't even have to have equipment to do that.
No,
I mean, you can
not at
do,
all.
some form of push-ups, whether from your knees or, up against the walls. You can just so, you can do all sorts of things that are body weight, just squats, so you can do things that will strengthen your legs, that will strengthen your arms and shoulders, that don't require any equipment whatsoever. That if you do those things, as you say, that 10 or 15 minutes, particularly, you will get stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. The second piece that I would ask them to consider implementing would be somewhere between 20 and 45 minutes of low to moderate intensity cardiovascular exercise over the course of the week. A couple of times, 2 to 3 times is plenty. And just going back to that previous example, if it's someone who doesn't really do anything at all, it could just be a 20-minute walk at
Yep.
whatever pace. If it's somebody who's maybe walks regularly, it's okay, well, can you increase the intensity of your walk or even implement a jog for 20 seconds at a time, a few times over the course of your usual 20-minute walk? So that doesn't have to be, running 5 miles on the treadmill 5 days a week or anything like that. Just a little bit more than what you've been doing. And then the last piece I would say going into that mobility and flexibility aspect is whether it's some form of light stretching or just moving through different positions that are outside of your normal day-to-day movements patterns that you tend to perform. Try to do 5 minutes of that as many days a week as you can. Over time, though, the compounding effect of 15 minutes of strength training a couple times a week, 20 to 45 minutes of some sort of cardiovascular exercise, 5 minutes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days a week, 5 minutes of mobility during those windows, and just moving the body in ways that it's not used to moving or stretching a little bit, that can have a tremendous impact on how well somebody feels over time. And it can be the thing that ultimately lands them in a place that they never thought that they would be able to get to. And all it takes is making a decision to do something on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And my last little note that I would urge people to consider on that is, again, going back to something is always going to be better than nothing. But the biggest thing is figuring out how to be able to do it with some amount of consistency. So that's a whole nother conversation to be had when you're talking about how can you try to implement new habits and all of that. But if you just commit to 10 minutes a day of one of those three things over the course of the day, and let that be where you start. 10 minutes of movement. Start there. And with time, there will be plenty of opportunity for you to progress. And there's no shortage of resources out on the internet where if somebody wasn't 100% sure
Yeah.
what to do for, 10 minutes of body weight exercises, you Google 10-minute body weight exercise routine and you'll get a bunch of hits there. So, we're very fortunate that this day and age, we have access to all sorts of information. So I would say, if you need, you just do a little Google search, but just to summarize that, I'd say 15 minutes of some sort of body weight or other resistance training 2 times a week, maybe three, 20 to 45 minutes of some sort of cardiovascular exercise 2 times a week, 3 times a week, maybe, and then 5 minutes of movement outside of your normal movements that you tend to perform as often as you like. And I think that those three things done with consistency can start to make a pretty significant difference.
Right. So strength, breathe, some cardiovascular, something that causes you to breathe, and something that causes you to, expand your range of motion. And I think the big thing is for anybody listening is start where you are
Yeah.
and just do a little bit consistently and just keep it simple because the victory, the progress is in the consistency more than really the intensity. If you just do a little bit from where you are and then, a little bit more from where you are 1 month from now, then the progress can be huge. And what I want to really encourage people as we kind of close out things is that maybe you just have to take my word for it on this, but you will be so profoundly surprised by the impact that taking these small baby steps in this direction will have in the other areas of your life. And I've seen this with myself and so many friends of how this is so life-giving when you begin to give consideration to the wellness of your body. And, I even think about it just from a verse in scripture says, I urge you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. And God does care about our bodies. And that may be surprising and we may not get it until we do it. So I want to encourage you and I thank you for kind of these good practical, just moving forward is so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know this because you've been through the process, but if anybody listening ever has any questions, I don't know if we can share some sort of contact information or a link or something, but that's one of those things that we do too. We are always happy to meet with somebody for a complimentary consultation and allow them to ask questions and give them feedback. And we have plenty of folks who have come in and taken advantage of an hour of our time and picked our brains and asked us to help give them a little bit more direction in terms of how they can start to execute some of these things on their own. And we are always happy to do that too. So for any of your listeners who might have more questions,
Yeah.
we're always happy to talk with any of them.
Well, absolutely. And I know you well enough to say that you are genuine in just, a desire to help people and to meet people without obligation. So
Yeah.
where would people connect with you, Vic?
So they can either find us at nextformfit.com, or if they have an interest in meeting with someone pertaining to nutrition side of things a little bit more, they could go to catalystfitrva.com. And on both of those sites, on those homepages, there are links to sign up for complimentary consultations.
Right. We'll put all of that, in the show notes. And again, I just want to have a final encouragement to people that there's so much life to be had in paying attention and trying to push through some of the mental, emotional barriers that we have to delving into this area of our bodies and our wellness and our strength. And I just want to encourage people, anybody wants to reach out to me, I'd love to, share my story, in terms of some of that. I just it excites me because there's so much fertile ground, I think, for and progress for us to make that can be so great for people. So Vic, thanks for
But
joining me on this, and I will be back in your studio on Thursday, and you'll have to be nice to me then.
yeah, no worries, man. No, I always look forward to our time together. So yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Tommy.
Great. Well, thanks for everybody listening to this, and I hope it's been helpful. Maybe a little bit different from some of our episodes, but I hope it's been helpful to you, and I hope it'll be something that you can practically put into your daily routine. So, thanks everybody for listening, and I look forward to being back with you next week. Thanks.